the Forage Alberta Starting Off on the Right Hoof webinar this evening. We are quite excited to have this webinar happening with us tonight. And we have a couple of people who have joined us, and they're going to share their knowledge and expertise in a couple of areas. So we will have Cameron Olson presenting on how to select a project animal, and then Barry Yaremcio will be talking about how to start your animal on rations. So I will be introducing them just before their presentation. So once again, thank you very much for joining us. And we'll just start with a brief overview of all the options that are available within Forage. So just again, the contents for the webinar for this evening, beef project options, selecting your project animal, and then starting your project on feed. As Barry had indicated before, there is the chat option at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions or comments throughout the webinar, please feel free to use that. We will be answering questions at the end. All right, and then we'll get started with the beef project options. So within Forage Alberta, we have a number of beef project options, and I'm sure that most of you are aware of the first one that we have here on our screen, and that's the Market Beef Live project, otherwise known as a steer project. And traditionally it's done as a steer project. However, if you felt the need or the desire, you could also use a heifer in this project that is obviously raised for show and slaughter. The minimum requirement is that it's on feed for 160 days, and that a member does most of the requirement of the rearing and the training as well. I'm sure you guys are very familiar with this project. On the same vein with the beef production line, we have the Market Beef Carcass project, and that is raised for slaughter and carcass evaluation. And really this is where you get a look at what's under the hide and the product that you are raising. There are a number of carcass competitions across the province, whether that's your club, district, and we even run a carcass competition at the provincial level, which you guys hopefully have seen some information about. We're into our third competition this year. We have a heifer project that is really the start of a continuum, and that is a commercial or a purebred animal born for this year to be born in 2018, and it's raised for show and production. Hopefully, we will see that heifer come back and be a cow-calf project. Just remember that you do need to complete your heifer project and all of the requirements. So you need to have shown that animal or completed an achievement day with that animal, as well as met the member requirements with it. And this project members can gain more experience in the practical aspects of beef production. In the beef pen, so now we're into the projects that we definitely don't see the numbers that we see with the steer and the heifer project and even the carcass project, but they are options that are available to people. And there's a few down here that I'm actually quite excited about because there seems to be some more interest in them. There is a beef pen option, and that is where you raise 3 or more animals for breeding or private sale. So that's if you wanted to have a pen of steers that you're going to raise and market yourself, or if you wanted to have a breeding pen of 3 or more animals, then that's for you if you have an interest in advanced beef production and you maybe would like to take on more than one animal. Just note that you can't use any of your other projects in this one. Novice beef, that is for somebody who maybe doesn't have any experience with beef or in the beef project, and they just take a calendar year calf. So this should be born in the year 2019, and they raise it, feed it, and train it to show just as you would your heifer or your steer, just it's a smaller animal. Something that I'm really quite excited about is the Beef Creative Options project, and that is something that we're kind of seeing a lot of interest in. The number of calls that we've received this fall about what can I do if I don't have time or access to raise an animal, and really a beef creative option is anything not covered in the previous options. So if you wanted to learn more about the various aspects of the beef production system, feel free to research various areas on that. If you wanted to learn more about meat cutting or anything beyond harvest, then why not take that as beef creative options? Really, this is anything relating to the beef industry that is not covered in our other options. If there are senior members who are doing a green certificate through school, They can also get credit for the Beef Green Certificate program through 4-H, so they can get credit as a 4-H project. They just need to work with their members for that, or pardon me, their leaders for that. So just make sure you're always talking with your leaders about the options and everything that is available to you. If you want to learn a little more about these options that we have within the beef project, feel free to check out the beef link, and we'll make sure we post all these links that we're going to be talking about throughout the night in the YouTube channel and anywhere else that we post this. We'll make sure we mention and include the links that we're talking about. But there are links to the 4-H projects that are available on our 4-H website, both through the policy as well as through the beef e-learning resources that are available on the website. So again, feel free to check them out at any time, and just don't be afraid to try something new and explore all that 4-H has to offer. All right, so one of the panelists that we have joining us this evening is Cameron Olson. Cameron grew up on a small cow-calf operation southeast of Calgary, Alberta. He was active in 4-H starting in 2003 and participated in 4-H beef steer, beef heifer, pen of 3, market hog, multi-species judging, and multi-projects in the Bow Valley Beef and Multi Club, as well as the Balzac 4-H Beef Club for 9 years. Cameron was also an active member of the Canadian and Alberta Junior Limousine Association and enjoyed showing his purebred limo females at any summer junior shows. Currently, Cameron is pursuing a PhD in animal science at the University of Alberta and has completed a bachelor's and master's degree in in animal science, both at Texas A&M University. So if we can welcome Cameron to the screen, that would be great. How are we doing, Cameron?
Not too bad, thanks.
That's good. I'm not seeing your screen.
Just 1 sec.
Perfect.
There we go.
Thank you.
Okay, guys. So the first part of this evening, we're going to talk about how to select a 4-H animal. We'll talk mostly about steer calves, but we'll also touch on what you should look for in a 4-H heifer project as well. So when we're looking at our 4-H calves this fall, we should probably be looking at them right now. This is a prime time of year to be thinking about selecting your animal. Most calves are being weaned right now, so if your neighbors or whatever are weaning, that's a good time to go over and have a look at your calf. And when you do that, the most important things that you're going to look at in your steer calves and in your heifer calves are going to be that they're the right size for the program that we're doing, which is 4-H, and they're going to need to exhibit some excellent, we're going to call it excellent structure and muscling. And we say excellent because we're going to be showing these cattle later on in their life, and they need to be able to compete a little bit as well. So we want them to have better than industry average structure and muscling. But primarily, we need them to be in a very specific weight class at very specific times of the year. Unfortunately, 4-H is not like commercial beef industry where we can kind of wait for cattle to be ready before they go to market. All of our cattle that are sold through Alberta 4-H are expected to be market acceptable at a very specific time of the year, which is for Achievement Day sale, whatever time of year your sale is. So usually we would like to see our cattle finishing for sale day somewhere between 1,200 and 1,350 pounds at 0.4 inches of back fat, 0.4 of an inch of back fat. So they need to be carrying an adequate amount of fat at that time of year in order to qualify them as market acceptable, and they need to be at the appropriate weight. So I've just used some average dates in here. These might be a little bit longer than some of your feeding periods. It might be a little bit shorter. I don't think they'll be too much shorter than most of yours, but if we have a average of a November 15th weigh-in day with a June 15th sale day, that offers us 212 days of growing opportunity. There's 212 days to feed that animal and try and get it to our optimum marketing. During this period, our steers are going to be averaging 2.5 to 3.5 pounds per day. So if we take that and we kind of backtrack when we're looking at our calves this fall, what weight do we need those calves to be coming into the 4-H program? At the low end of that gain, if you have a calf that's only gaining 2.5 pounds, over those 212 days, that calf is going to gain about 530 pounds or so. If you have a calf that's gaining at the higher end of that, that calf is going to gain almost 750 pounds in that 212 day period. So on average, if you just take the average of those two, simple average, our gain is going to be about 630, 640 pounds, somewhere in there. And our finished weight should be somewhere around 1,275, 1,300 pounds on average. So if we have 1,275 as our finished weight, we can subtract that average gain weight, which gives us an average starting weight of 640 pounds. So the calves that you're looking at right now by November 15th probably should not be any smaller than 600 pounds. And on the other end of that scale, they shouldn't be any bigger than about 750 pounds. So if your sale day is earlier, it's in the middle of May, you want to make sure that you're picking calves that are a little bit bigger, making sure that you're much closer to that 750 pounds on weigh day than the 600 pound mark, so that you can get your cattle to a realistic market endpoint by the time they need to go for sale. So the next thing that we need to talk about is how your cattle look, how they move, and how they appear as beef animals. So I've got a couple of comments on this slide. The first one says, we really appreciate the structural soundness of this steer as he gets out on the move. And the second one is the width and thickness of this steer is excellent. Both of these things are something that you kind of want the judge to say about your animal at Achievement Day, at any other shows that you might be taking your animals to between now and Achievement Day. These are the things that we really look at when we're looking at beef steers, when we're selecting beef heifers as well. But what do they really mean? So the judge says that, what does it really mean? Well, when we're talking about he really gets out and moves, we really like the way this steer stands. He's really nice in his skeleton. We're talking about his skeletal correctness. Fortunately for 4-H members, as calves, beef cattle are easy to judge for structure. There's not a lot of other stuff going on. They're not very heavily developed. Muscle is there. It should be present, but it's not hiding anything, and neither is fat. As cattle get fatter and larger, some of these structural correctness issues can start to be a little bit harder to see. But in general, when we're watching our calves walk across in front of us on what we call the profile, so they're going from left to right to left in front of us, we want to look at their feet, and when they're walking, those hind feet should fall pretty close to exactly where that front foot left off. So there should really only be 2 hoof prints for every stride that an animal takes. When you're watching an animal walk away from you, the legs should be traveling straight underneath the animal. Nothing should be swinging out or swinging in. Certainly nothing should be like knocking against one another. So those legs need to be straight, and they need to just look like they're not at funny angles. Is it really the easiest way to put that for the purposes of this evening? So on that point, if you're kind of new to this, you don't really know what you're looking for in beef cattle structure, I'd encourage you to go onto Google. It's a pretty powerful tool. There's a lot of online documents that are really, really good at explaining this more in depth, a lot of videos on judging beef cattle structure. So this is an important point because this calf needs to be able to move around for the entirety of his life. And we know that it's a shorter life than a heifer project, but it's still important that your steer can move, get to his feed, get to his bed, especially on the heifer side of things. When you're looking at judging a heifer calf, those structural characteristics are going to be indicative of the calves that heifer will have, but also of her parents and how structurally correct they were. We want to always be improving our national herd in terms of structural correctness. So it's important to be selecting calves that are structurally correct as well. But finally, especially for your beef cattle steer, he's going to be getting really heavy really quickly. He's going to be putting on a lot of weight in less than 212 days. And his structure needs to be able to handle all of that. So he needs to have big feet. He needs to have a skeleton that's going to be able to withstand the stress of putting that much weight on that quickly. So that was structural correctness. When we look at beef cattle, we're looking also at muscularity. So beef animals, their primary job is to produce beef, and that beef is a muscle. So we need to look for animals that have a lot of natural muscle occurring in them already as calves. And what we want to look for when we are selecting for muscle is an animal that has a pretty wide base. When you look at the animal from the front or from the back, their legs should not be touching or their hooves should not be touching when they reach the ground. If they're walking away from you, they should have 4 definite corners to them, if you will. They shouldn't look like they can walk along on a 2x4. And all of that has to do with the muscle in between their back legs and their front legs is literally pushing their skeleton apart. So if their skeleton is narrow, then the animal is what we call light muscle. It doesn't have much natural muscle to him, and he never will. Muscle is also round, so we need to make sure that we're looking for animals that aren't flat in their appearance. When you look at an animal's hindquarters, you shouldn't be able to really tell where the pin bones or the end of his hip is right up around his tail head. There should be quite a bit of natural roundness to that area. And then if you look over his back, you shouldn't be able to see any spine or anything like that over his back either. So all of that area needs to be round and filled out, and it's not going to be filled out with fat at this point. So what you should be seeing is genuine muscle. And in general, what we want to avoid is animals that appear to be kind of gangly, disproportionately big in some area or long looking. So we don't want big long legs on anybody. And we want to avoid selecting calves that are crossed with a dairy breed. So we want to avoid those Holstein cross calves. We want to avoid Jersey cross calves for this reason. They just don't have the muscle that we're going to want them to have. So those were the 3 things. We want to make sure that our calves are going to be the right size at the right time. We need to make sure that they're structurally correct enough to bear the weight that we're going to be putting on them. And we need to make sure that we're selecting beef calves for a beef cattle project. And I mean by that we are selecting calves with muscle. So those were the 3 main points that you need to keep in mind. But I've included some general things here just for you to keep in the back of your mind and think about when you're selecting your steers. There might be a push for some of you to say, okay, well, I want to buy a steer that's going to win the show. And to be quite honest with you, there's as many $15,000 to $20,000 steers that lose by the time they get to market weight, lose their class, come middle of the road, as there are $1,200 steers that actually end up winning that class. And there's a lot of stuff that can happen in the 200 and some days that you're feeding this animal. Good steers good steers that look good as calves don't very often make it all the way to market weight, still looking like the same animal. But then you can have an animal that, probably isn't going to win much of a show today, turn into a really bang up animal after you finish feeding him. So don't let price dictate what you want. Make sure you're picking a quality animal, not picking based on what the seller thinks that animal is worth. In general, we want to avoid oddities, things like bottle calves, twins. They don't tend to perform very well. I know there's a push to select those because it can be quiet, but they don't perform, they don't grow. By the time you get to the end of your 4-H year, you have a calf that doesn't look good, hasn't fed out well, and doesn't perform in the show ring either. We want to also avoid hobby breeds, things like longhorns and mini Herefords, lowlines, basically any breed that you don't have in the mainstream commercial feedlot industry. You don't really want, because there's a reason they're not in the commercial industry. They don't feed well, and they don't really perform all that well in the 4-H program either. So we want to avoid those. So with that, your best bet is to go to the neighbors, or if your family has a herd of commercial cows, or even purebreds. Go out, have a look at what you've got available to you in your area. Have a look at their calves, have a look at your calves, and pick a couple. And so when you pick a couple, one of the big things that you need to look for after those three major ones is temperament. You can't have an animal that you're not going to be able to halt. And so the temperament is a little bit flexible because it depends on how old the 4-H member is. Seniors can probably handle something a little bit larger and a little bit stronger than a junior member can. But you do need to take that into consideration. If the calf is going to tear your trailer apart when you want to take him home, you probably should look somewhere else for that. And then finally, it's not really about winning Achievement Day. I know there's a show associated with all sale days in Alberta, but it's really not about that. Coming first is a temporary thing, but the skills that you get in learning how to judge cattle, feed them, care for another living thing, and make sure it doesn't die on you before you can sell it. Those are the skills that you need to come away with, not selecting an animal that's going to win every show that it walks into. So that's what you have to keep in mind. As I said, there's a lot of really good resources available online with a lot more information than we can get into in one webinar. So I would encourage you to go and have a look at these. These are some of the ones that were pretty high quality when I did a brief Google search. We'll make sure that these are available to you after the webinar. So with that, I think that wraps up my section of the webinar, and we'll turn it over to Lexi. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Cameron. We will now have Barry Yaremcio join us to talk about starting your project animal on feed. Barry was born on a mixed farm in northeastern Alberta, and he completed a bachelor's degree in agriculture, specializing in animal science from the University of Alberta in 1984. After completing university, he started with Alberta Agriculture as a district agriculturalist in 1985. For the next 3 years, he worked as a in the district office and then transferred into the animal nutrition lab in Edmonton as a lab nutritionist and later as the provincial beef nutritionist. In 1994, Barry left Alberta Agriculture and worked in the private industry as a nutritionist for UFA and later with a private feed company. In 2003, he rejoined Alberta Agriculture as a beef and forage specialist at the Ag Info Center in Stettler. In 2005, Barry started working on the feed waste study as his project for a master's degree in animal nutrition. Currently, he is involved with research on the use of biochar as a feed ingredient for cattle. So welcome, Barry, and we're so thrilled to have you join us this evening.
Thanks, Lexi. Much appreciated. Glad I'm here. As we're going along, don't be afraid to ask questions if I can find it on the screen, but definitely write them down if we have to wait till the end of the day. Getting calves onto the feed, I could probably talk for 2 hours on this with everything that's been learned over the years. But the first thing we have to look at is a healthy calf is one that will grow and do well. So we need to look at how much and what should they eat as a starting animal, as a growing animal, and as a finishing animal. And we'll cover those 2 other segments, the grower and finisher, in 2 successive webinars at a future date. They need clean, accessible, water available at all times. They need to be kept out of the rain, the snow, and the wind. That'll all affect the health of the animal and the ability of the animal to use nutrients to grow rather than to stay warm. Try to use bedding, either shavings or straw. It doesn't really matter, but you need, an animal can lose up to 25% of its body heat, especially when they're small, 600-700 pound animals. They can lose a lot of heat into the snow or into a manure pile very quickly, and that will definitely negatively affect your ability to have that animal grow. And they need attention. Cows, steers, heifers, they're all social animals. They rely on somebody to feed them, to watch over them, and to see if they're healthy. So those are your basic responsibilities when you get into a 4-H project, or if you're keeping any type of an animal. So we've got 3 different phases when we feed an animal. And if you look at the feed companies, a lot of them have. If you're buying a complete ration from a feed company, They have a starting phase, a growing phase, and a finishing phase. And today we'll be just starting with the starting phase. How do we get the calf onto dry feed, and what type of feed products can be used to feed these animals? So if you're using a homegrown calf, you want to reduce the stress at weaning time so that that calf doesn't have a 2-week lag period or a part of the feeding period where it doesn't want to eat, it doesn't want to grow, it's just melancholy because it's been weaned. So if you've already selected the calf that you have, move it into the pen where you're going to be feeding that calf over the winter. Move both the cow and the calf into the pen. The cow will teach the calf where the water bowl is, where the feed bunk is, where to sleep. And when the actual day comes, when you take that cow out of that pen, the calf knows where everything is and it'll have less stress. The important thing is you want to feed the same ration that you're to the cow and calf before weaning as what the calf will be getting after weaning. That way, there's no surprises to that animal. It'll do very well. Now, you also, when you're taking that cow away from the calf, you don't want to take it half a mile away. If you can put it in the pen next to it so that the calf and the cow can see each other, they can touch noses, they will do that. In about 3 days, the calf will say, I don't need you, cow. You're not providing me with any milk. And it's actually the cow that has more problems with it because her udder is full of milk and she wants to get some relief. So when you're looking at a purchased calf, you don't have that option to do the preconditioning or pre-availability of that calf to understand where it's going to live. So you have to teach it where things are. You let the water bowl overflow just slightly so that the calf can see the water and smell it and find the water bowl. After a couple days, when you see the calf knows where the water bowl is, readjust the float, excuse me, so that you don't have any problems, pardon me, any problems with mud in the pen. Feed a hay that's mainly a grass product. If you throw a lot of a high quality hay with a lot of alfalfa in it, you're going to have troubles with potential digestive upsets, maybe even some bloat concerns. So the grass is a lot easier for the animal to chew, a lot easier for it to digest without any problems. When you're starting to feed the grain to the animal, if it doesn't know where the feed trough is, don't be afraid to throw a couple handfuls on the ground right along that feed trough. So as it's walking around, it'll smell it, it'll see it, and start picking it up. And if they see where the feed trough is, they're curious. They'll eventually put their head up over the side of the trough and feed out of the trough like they should be. In many situations, if you're putting that animal into a strange pen, or even if you're looking at an animal that you've got homegrown, don't be afraid to put a companion animal in there for comfort, so they have somebody to live with over the next 10 or 8 months. So what should be in the ration? You want to have a mixed hay in there. I wouldn't go more than about 25 to 30% alfalfa when that's starting hay. As they get older and they get used to the feed, you can increase the alfalfa content in the hay. You want to have roughly about 25% grain in that ration as well, or have them eat 25% grain in the ration itself. So on day one, the animals are under a lot of stress. They won't want to eat very much, and they should be consuming roughly 5 1/4 pounds of feed a day, dry feed a day. By the end of the first week, they should be up to 12 1/2 pounds of feed, or 1.75% of body weight. And then on day 14, and that's when the calves should be fully acclimatized to the situation and being on full feed at roughly 17 1/2 pounds, or 2.5% of body weight. These are reasonable guidelines to get the animal eating. The problem is, if they're eating too much, they can have digestive upsets. And by that I mean, if by day 7 they're just pounding back the feed and really going after it and they're eating too much, they can have a digestive upset. The manure may not look very good. And on the other side, if they're not willing to eat the feed, the problem you can have there is they can get weak and they can get sick. So you've got to be careful and just monitor what's going on, especially the first couple weeks of the acclimatization period. So feeding a 750-pound calf, the first couple of days, the 3 to 5 pounds, expect them to eat 3 to 5 pounds of long hay and a couple pounds of grain or starter ration. Make sure that there is some hay available at all times. By day 7, 8.5 pounds of hay, 3.5 pounds of grain or started ration, and by day 14, I got something here that's in my road. Okay. By day 13, you should have 13 pounds of hay and 5 pounds of starter or grain by that. Now, the question that a lot of people ask, should I be using oats? Should I use barley? What other grains can I include in the ration? Barley typically has a higher energy content and a little bit more protein than oats. Oats is a very digestible feed. One of the things that if you're trying to decide what to do, barley typically contains 10% more energy and 10% more protein on a pound for pound basis compared to oats. But it's sometimes easier for the animals to start eating oats. If you want to include peas or lentils or faba beans into the ration, all of them are exceptionally good. The nice thing about peas is you don't have to crack them or roll them. Once the calves go ahead and break the outer skin on the peas, it's entirely digestible. It is 24% protein. Faba beans, a little bit more concern with them. They tend to really make those animals shine and grow fast, but they need to be processed because they're just too big. You want to break them up into about 3 or 4 pieces. And the problems that you can get with faba beans is a little bit more than with the peas. Lentils, same thing as the peas, great energy, great protein, don't have to crack them and should be fine. Now, how do you feed the hay or what do you do with the hay? I'm just going to try to set this here for a second. Animals need a certain amount of effective fiber or long fiber in the diet, and that's to keep the rumen healthy. The calf needs to chew for periods of time to break down the fiber content in the forages. It also produces saliva, and in that saliva there's sodium bicarbonate, basically baking soda, so that it will buffer the rumen and it'll stay healthy. The one thing that you need to watch out for when you are starting off with a newly weaned calf is if you find that they're not eating the grain that you're providing to them, you may have to limit feed the hay so that they get adjusted to the taste of the grain. Probably after 3 or 4 days, you'll see that the feed trough or the bucket that you're feeding the grain in is empty. Then you can go ahead and put the hay back in free choice. It'll save you some work, but it's that adjustment period that you have to be careful. Okay. When you're looking at increasing the amount of grain in the ration, you need to do things slowly, because as you add more grain to the ration, the rate of digestion or the amount of digestion that occurs on that grain increases, not physically, but quantitatively. So if you're feeding 3 pounds of grain, you will get a certain amount of acid production in the stomach, and that's normal for any digestive process. But the thing is, if you change from 4 pounds of grain one day you're feeding, and then you go up to 6 or 7 in one shot, that could be too much of a stress on the animals. And what will happen is the animal will be subclinically acidotic, or you might have some grain overload problems, and especially on these smaller animals that haven't seen much grain previously. So the rule of thumb, that little thumb with the light on it, or with the golden thumb, is what I consider the rules of thumb, things that I watch for when I go out and look at animals on any operation, is how fast you increase the grain. And the rule of thumb that I use is you want to increase the grain by 1 pound every second day. So the problem is if they get too much grain or they get a acidosis problem, they get a sour stomach is an easy way to stomach, a big stomach ache. And it may take the animals up to 30 days to resolve the situation and get back on full feed. The easiest way to tell if your animal is doing well on the ration that they have is look at the manure. You don't want to have manure that's sloppy and runny like there is in the picture. It needs to be a nice flat cow pie with structure, and it looks normal. I guess that's the best way I can explain it over the webinar. If it tends to be runny like that, you've got acidosis problems. If it tends to pile up and in a pyramid shape and it looks more like horse manure, then there's a limitation on, not limitation, there's a shortage of protein in the ration and they can't digest feed properly. So if you're changing between silage and hay, using long hay for the starting period and then switching over to silage, it's probably the easiest thing on the animal. When you do want to change it out, start by taking 25% of the hay out of the ration and replace it with silage. Feed that for 2 to 3 days. And on the second and third steps, same thing, increase the silage by 25% on each of the steps, 2 or 3 days. Watch the manure, make sure that it still looks normal. It's not getting runny. If it's a little bit soft or a little bit runny, don't increase the second or third steps until you feel that the manure looks normal. Might need to get your folks to help you out with that one. Now, a lot of questions that I get is, okay, well, if I'm taking out a pound of hay, how much silage do I need to put into the ration? And a rough estimate, depending on moisture content, but a general, again, another general rule of thumb is you need 2.5 pounds of silage to replace 1 pound of hay. Understanding what the animal growth curve looks like, and Cameron alluded to this, that the animals, first thing they do is develop the bone. The next thing is the tissue and the muscle growth. And then during the finishing phase, your fat deposits are last, both the external and the marbling fat. They're all related to each other, but they're all time sensitive as well. So, for example, if you're starting off with a 700-pound steer, the protein amount that's being provided to those animals drives the rate of digestion and how much that feed that the animal can consume. It also helps develop the bone and also improve the rate of gain. And at this stage, it's basically all lean tissue. There's not much fat. So at 700 pounds, you need a ration that is 700-pound animal needs a ration that is roughly 13 to 14%. I know that some of the purebred breeders or the purebred animals that are going into the big shows in Calgary or Seattle or Colorado, they'll push their protein levels up a little bit higher as well. But in order for the animal to frame out properly, to stretch, and be able to develop the muscles, you need 13% minimum protein content in that entire ration so that things can happen. You might have some hay and where you're developing your own grain ration, or if you're buying pellets, combination of the two. If you only have 12% or 11% protein in the hay, then your protein content in the grain portion of the ration might have to be 15-16%. If you want the animal to gain roughly 2 pounds a day, that is something that should be happening roughly 14 days after the calf has been put onto the program. The manure should be looking normal. And another rough rule of thumb is you need to have roughly 1% of body weight in grain consumption or starter ration consumption to get that 1 pound or 2 pounds of gain when you're feeding either a reasonable quality hay or if you're feeding some silage. If you're feeding the replacement heifer and you're starting with an animal that's in that 600 to 650 weight, 700 weight category for the heifer, you can start the heifer exactly the same as the steer. At that point, the important thing is to get the animal onto grain and onto the hay so that it's healthy and doing well. But there's a big difference between heifers and steers at that 700, roughly 650 to 700 weight range. That's the point in time when heifers start to show puberty. They start developing the reproductive organs. They start developing the udder so they can be milkers. But the problem is if you overfeed the heifers and you push them too hard, feeding them to gain more than 1.75 pounds to 2 pounds of gain a day during puberty, basically from 7 weights until say 950 when they're up and starting the breeding season. If they're pushed too hard, the udder is developing 4 times faster than any other tissue in the body, and instead of developing milk secreting tissue in the udder, they're depositing fat, and that could reduce lifelong milk production in that heifer, and it will never change. It's important to be very consistent in what you're doing and how you're feeding that calf. For example, if I do this presentation in a club situation, I ask, okay, how many are involved with soccer or basketball or volleyball? And I'll get hands up and I'll ask, okay, can you be at home the same time every day to feed the animals? And the answer is usually no. And that's where you need to rely on help from your family, either your brother or sister or your parents if necessary. You want to feed the animals at the same time every day. If you decide it's 5 o'clock at night or at 7 o'clock at night, it's your choice, but you don't want to feed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon one day and then 10 o'clock the next day, because the meals are necessary to keep that rumen functioning. And if they're over hungry by not being fed at the same time and you're 3 or 4 hours late, they'll really eat the grain portion very rapidly when you provide that to them. And that could produce more acid in the stomachs and give you problems. So try to keep it as close as possible to the same time every day. And I'm going to say this here and I'll repeat it in the future presentations as well, but if you're getting up into that 8, 9, 10 pounds of grain a day into the animals during the growing and finishing phases, you want to split the grain into 2 feedings, half in the morning, half at night. Just improves efficiency and reduces the problems of getting an animal to eat the feed without having digestive upsets. Now, if you're purchasing a commercial ration from a feed mill and it's in a tote bag, you want to switch gradually between the batches, because the quality of the barley or oats or whatever grains in that ration can very easily change from one bag to the other. So if you've got a week to 10 days worth of feed in the old bag of starter ration or grower ration, you want to do the same thing as you did when you're changing from silage from hay to silage. The first 2 or 3 days, take 25% of the feed out of the new bag, mix it in with 75% of the old. After 2 or 3 days, if the manure looks good, go half and half. 3 or 4 days later, go up to 75% new, 25% old. Keep it on that ratio until the feed is all gone out of the old bag, and then switch over to 100%. Now, during the holiday season, and people feel like they need to give a present to the calf, or if you feel like giving that calf an extra 1 or 2 pounds of grain a day, just to get that extra gain on those animals, to give them a treat or try to improve their performance, consistency again is important. The way I look at this is, providing that extra grain will upset their feeding program, upset their balance, and could potentially cause a lot of problems with digestive upsets in the animals going off feed. It's like Christmas time. I've got certain dishes that I like to eat, but I know that there's a certain limit to how much I can consume without getting a bellyache or not feeling comfortable for the next 8 or 10 hours. Same thing with the calves. Keep it consistent both in time and the amount of grain ration that they're getting or prepared ration that they're getting. If there's no way for you to know what you can do or how the feeding program is going with the animal if you don't have a market record book or market beef record book filled out properly. Use the graphs that are on page 10. Try to do this monthly at least. You could potentially do it every 2 weeks if you want to, but you need to use a scale or find some way to weigh that animal over a scale. Way back when, we used to have charts that had heart girth measurements where you'd measure the animal with a tape measure on the heart girth, and you'd look up on the chart as to what the measurement was, and it would give you an approximate weight. Nothing beats a scale. And the question you have to ask, is the feeding program doing what you want it to do? A couple other things that I'd like to touch on is the efficiency of an animal can be impacted by the amount of grain that's being fed and how that grain is actually processed. You want to have roughly 75% any place above 75% of the kernels broken by either rolling or using a hammer mill. And all you want to do is break those kernels into 2 pieces. Anything finer than that will result in rapid digestion. You could have the acidosis a problem as well. To tell if you've done a good job, take a look at what's in the grain bin and pull it apart with a shovel. See what's left in the middle of the pile. That's where you'll find all the fines. So if you're processing too much, or if the grain's being processed too much, you've got a couple options. Either if you're using a roller mill, just widen the rollers a little bit. If you're using a hammer mill, slow the tractor down from full PTO speed down to 11 or 1200 RPM. That'll reduce the impact of the hammers onto the grain. It won't crack it up as much. Or put in an old set of hammers and an old screen so that you don't do as much damage to the grain. In summary, you need to do things in a gradual process. Small changes cause small problems. Big changes cause big problems. Unfortunately, animals cannot talk to you, but their behavior will provide clues on how they're doing. What does the manure look like? Do they have their head down? Are their ears down and droopy instead of up and upright? Are they kicking at their bellies? Are they not coming up to the feed bunk when you're feeding them? Those are the hints that you have to use to see if your animals are healthy or not. So the next webinar will be in November, as what Lexi has told me. I'll let her fill you in on that. We're going to talk about transitioning the calf from a starter to a grower program and into a finishing program. And how do you calculate out how long the animal should be kept in the grower phase so that it's finished? So with the calves coming on to feed here within the next week or two, I'm hoping this is enough to get you started. If not, my direct phone line is listed there. Or if you want to use the right line, it's 310-FARM or 310-3276. I'll answer any and all questions that come in. And my email address is there as well. So Lexi, I'm going to turn it back over to you and see where we go from here.
All right, thank you very much, Barry. And as Barry mentioned, the next webinar on the transitioning the calf from a starter to a grower program, the date for that will be November 27th. So please mark that in your calendars if you are interested. and we will once again be sharing it with all of our 4-H families through email and on Facebook. Just keep an eye out on Facebook for that to come out prior to November 27th. Are there any questions for Cameron or Barry at this time? There were none that came in through the presentation. Cameron or Barry, is there anything that you would like to add at this time, I guess?
I don't really think so. Just again, encourage guys to go and have a look at what's available online for learning how to look at cattle and judging small animals with the knowledge that there'll be big animals one day too. So yeah, I don't think there's really anything that I could add.
All right, thanks, Cameron. I can see a raised hand from our attendees. Oh, here we go. We have a question that says, can I feed my steer fruits and vegetables?
Fruits and vegetables?
Yes.
They provide a good source of fiber. Some of them will contain a high amount of water. And generally, the protein content of fruits and vegetables are fairly low. So that has to be taken into consideration when you look at the overall balancing of the ration. It can be done, it won't hurt them, but it may only be 5 or 10% of the total weight of the feed that you're giving them. You can't turn them into vegetarians. They're animals that like to eat forages, and they do need grains as well. Or I should rephrase that. The animals will not finish out properly if you go ahead and try to do everything with just forages. They will not gain enough weight. They will not finish properly in the time that you have available.
Thanks, Barry. Yeah, and they had added after if it was like an as a treat, like an apple.
Oh yeah, absolutely. If it's an apple or something you want to give them a treat, that I agree with. But you don't want to give a treat of an extra 3 or 4 pounds of grain one night just because you feel it's needed. The other thing I haven't touched on, but I should, is the use of an ionophore or an implant. The ionophores, such as Rumensin or Bobatech, and I'm not endorsing. You guys do what you want to do. If there's a club decision whether you're going to be using these products or not, an ionophore will help settle the rumen down. It'll also improve digestive efficiency of the animal. Implants, I should go this way. The ionophore will probably improve their digestive efficiency and growth rate by about 6, 7, 8%. Ionophores will also increase the efficiency of the animal. So if you use both, you might have any place from 12 to 15% improvement in efficiency. But in some clubs, they don't use the ionophore, they don't use the implant. The other side of the coin is some buyers will ask the question at the show, did you implant this animal, yes or no? And that might limit the number of buyers that are willing to bid on your calf at show day.
All right, thanks, Barry. Question for Cameron. Is it possible to use a Shetland pony as a friend for the steer?
I think, yes, I don't really see any reason why they wouldn't be compatible. You have to make sure there's some things that would complicate that a little bit. If you're feeding an ionophore, horses and other equids like donkeys and things cannot be exposed to that period. So you cannot allow that pony to eat that Rumensin treated or Bobatech treated grain. So that might complicate it a little bit if that's how you're going to be feeding the animal. The other thing is I do know that some horses and donkeys can be quite aggressive towards cattle, so you'd have to monitor that as well. But if you kind of throw them in there for a couple of days and everybody seems to be getting along and nobody has any bite marks or wounds or anything, it would be okay, but it would be better if you had another animal, and really another ruminant. I mean, if you have a goat kicking around, that would be better than, I would say, a horse. But best would be another cow or another steer. to have in there with it. That's first prize, but a Shetland pony would work, but there would be some caveats to that.
Okay, thank you, Cameron. Do they need a salt block, and when or how would you provide that?
If you're using a commercial starter ration or grower ration or a pellet that's from a feed mill, generally they include the vitamins and the minerals and the salt in that product. If you're putting out your own grain and mixing it home, there's none of those other things in it. So salt is essential. My recommendation is to use a brown or a green salt block, something that has the trace minerals, the selenium in it, rather than the blue salt block, which is only cobalt and iodine. So it will help a little bit with feed efficiency. For the homegrown ration, they definitely need the trace minerals that are in those blocks, the green or the brown blocks. If you're using the commercial ration, the little bit of extra selenium that they'll get out of that block, I don't expect them to eat very much. It won't hurt them, and it'll probably help them in the long run.
All right, thanks, Barry. This might be a combo question for both Cameron and Barry. The question is, if you are feeding 5 steers, how can you confirm that they're all getting the right amount of feed?
One of the easy, I'll take a first step at this, Cameron, if you don't mind. Watch how they're eating. Make sure there's enough bunk space for all animals to eat at the same time. You're going to need a roughly 30 to 36 inches of bunk space per animal so that they all can get access. And watch. Do you have an animal that is more aggressive and pushing others away? Do you have some that'll be there until the bunk is completely clean and the others have already walked away? It will show up in size, but it'll take a long time to do that. The eating behavior of the animals is probably the best way to tell if they're all getting their fair share. The other thing is watch the back end of the animals. If some are a little bit dirtier with loose manure, that tells me that one's getting a lot more than it should.
All right.
On that, Cameron?
No, yeah, I think you covered it.
All right. So we just have a couple more questions, and then I think we'll call it a night. We are at that hour mark, or it's creeping up on us really quickly. We do have a question about when to start a calf on feed when it's still on the cow. So I'm thinking this is a cow-calf pair situation. When would you start it on feed?
If the pasture is down and there's not much left on pasture, if the calf is more than 150 days of age, the rumen is fully functional, or the digestive system is fully functional, so that the cow will teach the calf how to eat hay. And if you can do that, the transition to a weaned animal is so much easier. So anytime over 150 days, let them go at it. Creep feeding, that can start at 45 or 50 days of age because the animals can digest the grain at an earlier age.
All right, thank you. I'm just going back to the salt block question. Do you use the same type of salt block with females?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. And then we do have a fairly specific question to end on, and that was, I just need to scroll up to find it. For starting an animal out on feed, is a 32% supplement and beet pulp ration acceptable?
32% ration. Typically, we're designed to be fed at 1 pound per head per day for a mature cow. Depending on how good of a quality there is for the hay and the grain, you might be able to get away with a little bit less, but use that 1 pound a day as a good rule of thumb. Sorry, the other half of the question?
And with beet pulp.
Beet pulp is used in the dairy industry to increase the fiber content in the ration and cause the cows to chew more. That increases the butter fat for the dairy. But if you're feeding a reasonable quality hay or a good grain silage, there's more than enough fiber in those feeds. Beet pulp tends to be very fibrous, very low quality. It takes a lot longer for that to pass through the digestive system and move out of the rumen so they can eat more. So if you're not having troubles with a high concentrate ration or a high finishing ration, where things are going sideways on you, I really don't see the need for beet pulp in the ration at all.
All right, thank you. I think we're at our hour mark, so we'll call that a night. Barry has graciously provided his contact information that's still available on the screen. I'm also available through the 4-H hotline, which is 780-422-4H4H, or in my office at 403-948-8501. And I think that goes for any questions that would be for myself about 4-H, or for Cameron. I think I could pass them on to you through that method. Would that be all right as well?
Absolutely.
That works for you, Cameron? Yep.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys very much. Thank you to Barry and Cameron for joining us tonight and sharing the information with us. And thank you to all of those who joined us this evening. It was great to have you. And just a reminder that the next webinar will be on November 27th, and that will be focusing on transitioning the calf from a starter to a grower program. Thank you very much. Have a great night.